Okay, on to our next goal, which was growth or progress. When we're looking at progress, Smith thought that there were two features that were going to help us out tremendously. The first is the division of labor, and the second was another self-regulating mechanism that we'll get to in the next slide. But the first one was described as the division of labor because Smith, in his travels around England, started to recognize that there were manufacturers that were starting to pop up. And in his day and age, that pretty much meant 10 guys in a shed, practically. Very small scale, but it was still quite impressive because they were centralizing production and they were dividing up the tasks between labor. And those laborers were in a position where they could specialize, and they were getting very, very large productivity gains. So the classic example is Adam Smith's pin factory. And in the pin factory, he noticed that they were taking the very, very simple product of a pin. I'm talking about one that you use for sewing, obviously. And they were dividing it into about 10 different tasks. One person was going to roll the wire straight. One person was going to cut it. One would sharpen. 2 or 3 separate little tasks in terms of attaching the head to the pin. Someone was whitening. Someone was boxing. It was basically like a little assembly line, although it wasn't necessarily a continuous flow process. These 10 folks were actually able to produce 2,000 to 4,000 pins a day. And you're probably going, yeah, so what? Well, one person was only able to do about 20 pins a day. So if you were to take 20 times 10, of course, you really are only looking for a much, much smaller number, 200 pins. And they, in fact, were not getting 200 pins. By dividing the labor up, they were getting to a much, much larger output. Smith thought that one of the things that capitalism was going to do was provide a multitude of opportunities to finally divide labor and to get these sort of gains. And the thing that made him so happy about this was he was thinking about the wealth of society actually being like a pie. It was all the goods and services that were produced in a given time period, and this was pretty radical. A lot of folks back then seemed to think that the store of wealth or gold was the most important thing. And Smith said that no, what was important was the amount of goods and services that a society was consuming in any given year. Well, with the division of labor and these kinds of gains, he is clearly seeing that the pie can be made much, much larger. So he's excited about this, and he actually thinks that people following their own self-interest, and the next self-regulating mechanism we're going to talk about, is going to drive this division of labor. Okay, so let's look at that second self-regulating mechanism with progress. Smith believed that capitalists who were doing well were going to make profits. I'm going to use pi as a symbol of profit. And he believed that they would take these profits and they would reinvest those. And as they reinvested those in the business, because why not? My business is making money, let's grow it. He thought that these folks were going to need more labor. And I'm going to mark this as LD, which is labor demand. It's going to be an increase in the amount of labor demanded from capitalists as they try to grow their business. And of course, if they need a bunch more labor, but we don't have any more labor than we used to, this should put upward pressure on wages. And I'm going to use that W to mark out wages. Smith referred to this as the law of accumulation. And the law of accumulation is great in his mind because people growing their businesses and reinvesting would very, very likely lead to a bigger and bigger economy because the division of labor would keep increasing. However, it's not without its problems because it seems as though businesses doing well leads to growing wages. And growing wages, according to Smith, meant that profits would eventually bottom out and progress or growth would stop. He said not to worry about that though, because there was also another law that you could count on, and that was the law of population. And Smith believed that with an increase in wages, this one that we were talking about here, same one, this increase in wages would actually increase the population. And you're probably thinking, whoa, just because people get paid more doesn't mean there are more people. But actually it might. You might actually find that, especially in his day and age, that a higher wage would mean that you could essentially keep more children alive. You got to realize he's writing in the end of the 1700s. Their average woman in the Scottish Highlands was actually giving birth about 18 times, but only 2 of those children were surviving. If you started to actually pay higher wages, that turned into food that went into their mouths and people survived. And of course, with a higher population, there would be a higher labor supply. And with more and more people out there competing for jobs, they of course would drive their wages back down. And with wages falling, you would know that profits are once again on the rise. So what's actually happening here is falling wages rejuvenates profits and sets this whole entire thing off again. So this is really just a circle. These two things then constitute another self-regulating mechanism. Okay, this SRM. This self-regulating mechanism is also pretty closely tied to another topic that pops up quite frequently nowadays, and that's the notion that we should leave the economy alone. We should not interfere with it. And you'll hear this most ardently championed by conservative folks. They'll basically tell you that everyone knows their own mind and their own self-interests. You don't need to help them with that, and by helping them, you just interfere with the pricing cues and the market mechanism. So they're going to argue that the best possible policy towards the market is laissez-faire. Very loosely, this translates out to let do or let it alone. Okay. Now, in Smith's day and age, he clearly was not an advocate of the sort of anarcho-libertarian zero government that we associate with really, really strong advocates of laissez-faire now. He had a much more measured approach, but he was looking at all kinds of ways in which the government had involved themselves in really kind of just obviously inefficient ways. They were selling monopolies in order to fill up the royal treasuries as a way of raising funds for the crown. But of course, a monopoly implied there'd be no competition going forward. Smith found this terrible, and he's definitely thinking that you should not intervene any more than you have to. That being said, he has some very clear roles where he thinks that the government is going to be necessary in order for a market to function well. Okay, so let's talk about those roles for government. Smith thought that there were at least 3. 1, the military. 2, some sort of judiciary. And 3, he thought that there was definitely a role for public works. So the military is probably one of the most obvious. He didn't think that you should hire mercenaries. He definitely didn't think that self-interest was the way to go here. It'd be interesting to hear what he'd say about the extensive use of private militaries now, or private contractors. The other one that he's going to make a big deal of is this judiciary. And you could also couple the judiciary with an executive branch. But really, what we're talking about here is some sort of rule of law or a private property regime where people can invest, they can buy things, they can be reasonably assured that their rights to those things will be defended. And to put it in very modern terms, people are not going to engage in activities if they're not assured that they will reap the benefits of those activities, right? So this is a big one. This, of course, matches up really well with what Hubbard's describing at the end of chapter 2. The third one that Smith thought was going to be of interest was public works, and he wasn't convinced that there were going to be individuals that were rich enough or had the wherewithal to engage in some of the types of things that would make an economy very, very well off, like interstate highways or airports or very large bridges. So you could think about this in terms of infrastructure. And he believed that it was in society's best interest if the government provided those sorts of things to widen out the extent of market and allow people to specialize more and more heavily and engage in more and more trade. So this is a definite role that he had in mind for the government. Another one that bears mentioning is he really thought that education was going to be a very, very important thing. And he wasn't thinking about this so much in terms of growth, although I don't think he was clueless about that. His main concern was that capitalism seemed like it was going to be dividing work down into smaller and smaller little pieces. And Smith was a little terrified that capitalism might end up creating the stupidest working class that's ever existed. Because if you spend your entire existence in a factory doing the same exact task again and again for 12 to 14 hours, which would have been common in the Industrial Revolution in England, this was not exactly good for human development. So Smith, revealing his strong humanist roots, was very, very interested in education as a way to make sure that the sort of political liberty and ability of folks to function as human beings would stay intact. Another interesting side note that I think that bears mentioning is Smith had a lot of faith in competition, and it looked as though most industries were easily entered and joined in his day and age. But in the modern day, it seems as though we have more and more oligopolies or monopolies, industries dominated by only a few or only one very, very large firm. And of course, that would imply very, very little competition. Smith would have been worried about this, and I think that he would have given another role to the government in the modern day, which is essentially regulating competition or perhaps breaking up large firms. We're going to look at this at the end of chapter 15 with antitrust legislation. But I wanted to highlight it for you at this moment. Anyhow, at this point, you've got a pretty good handle on Smith, right? Why does society hold together? The invisible hand. Why does it grow? The law of accumulation and the law of population tend to further the division of labor, help us specialize and grow that pie. So, in a nutshell, not a bad little overview of Smith. Talk to you guys soon.